And you may begin, again, with an introduction of who you are and your work with the district.
I'm Ed Waltman. I began working with the Mankato School District on July 1st of 1974 and had the pleasure to serve all of our communities from 1974 to June 30th of 2009, or 35 years. 21 of those years was spent as the Director of Business Affairs, working with the daily operation of the district in terms of finance, buildings and grounds, transportation, food service, those sorts of things. And then spent a couple of years as the assistant superintendent, and thanks to some great mentors, I became in 1997 co-superintendent with Dave Dakin. In addition to that, I was the first non-traditional superintendent in the state of Minnesota. What I mean by that is the first superintendent that wasn't ever a classroom teacher, which was the requirement before that. And had a wonderful career with our Mankato area public schools, and working with all our communities. When I go outside of things, people don't realize that Mankato is a long-time consolidated district, not just Mankato and North Mankato, but Madison Lake, Eagle Lake, Skyline, the Hillier, quite a diverse, different communities, and it was fun to work with all the various public officials and all the different buildings that we had. When I came in 1974, Mankato East Senior High had just been opened. 1 year, so I came the second year, and there was obviously a great transition to two high schools in the Mankato area, and that was a big decision that they made 1 year before I came, but there was still a lot left to be done even after 1 year. And at that time, Mankato area schools was seeing great growth. We had up to 7,000 students. But shortly after I was there, as enrollments always change, we started declining. And it probably created the most confusing and critical time in terms of where the district would go over any time in the history of those 35 years that I was there. Within 2 years after I was there, approximately, we closed Union Elementary School, which is now a beautiful office building. We closed that building and had many budget reductions, which also included during that timeline the closing of Wilson Campus School, and that was more driven by then Mankato State University than us. They actually pulled their funding for the program, but there were some disappointed people that the Mankato School District wasn't in a position to take that program on, which was a valuable option. Before people knew about different options of learning, the Wilson Campus School was a valuable option for our community to have. But at that time we were declining enrollment, and we were cutting and closing Union School and other schools, and we couldn't do that. That was really my first, I was fairly young at that time, my first foray into how people can get emotional about schools, closing schools. I can still remember the day that the coffin with all the trophies came down the hill from the Wilson Campus School and was laid on our administrative cabinet desk by a group of students and parents, disappointed that the district hadn't. I also at that time there was a petition where they wrapped up our school board at their board meeting in a petition, and I had to get a scissors to cut them out. So that was kind of a unique experience as well, because I didn't sit at the board that time. I sat at a separate table, and so real strong emotions about that, and rightly so. The Wilson Campus School was a wonderful alternative. Before, in the 90s, we started seeing alternatives, and I'll talk more about that later.
One question I've got, was that actually part, it was part of the university, right? Because I'm reading a lot about the normal schools, and it seemed like they had their model school.
It was part of the university, but the funding from the state couldn't go to the university for K-12 education. So technically, Mankato Area Public Schools was the holder of the Wilson Campus School, and that's how people didn't understand that. And so technically we were, but it was really Mankato State that was facing their own budgetary problems. A lot of people were at that time that pulled out, because the Wilson Campus School is a small school, couldn't really survive, as most small schools can't, on the basic funding formula that public schools were getting at that time. And of course, as I mentioned, Mankato Public Schools wasn't in a position to subsidize that, continue that school. But we continued on with some very difficult times. In fact, within the 10-year period after I came from 1974, we actually lost 1,000 students, went from 7,000 students back down to 6,000 students. And the first thing, probably the most difficult decision I saw our school board make over that, and the administration to make a recommendation over that 35-year period of time, whether to close the junior highs was the choice, or to go back, and move them into the high schools and make our high schools 712, or go back to one high school and make one large junior high. And so either one of those two options were not very attractive, because if you went to one big junior high, the busing would be all over the district to one building, either on the east side or west side. And which building would be the high school? Would it be Old Mankato High or the new East High? All those issues were looming with that. And if we did that, the Lincoln building, the North Mankato building, and the, what was our other, we had 3 junior highs, Franklin building,
yeah.
Would have all been closed and empty, so we would have had 3 empty buildings as well. So how do we repurpose our facilities to manage the financing for the district was a critical decision. And then looking long term, if the community would again start to grow, if we did close all those facilities, if both the one high school and one junior high would be right at the maximum capacity. And we really didn't know. The administration, after careful study, recommended to the board that we go to 2 712s to remain the 2 sides of town to help us facilitate future growth. We repurposed Garfield into a 6th grade school at that time to create space in our west side elementaries, and we repurposed Franklin to a 6th grade school plus a K-5 for the east side of town. Was the final recommendation to the board. And the superintendent and the rest of the administrative team went to the board meeting that night. There was 3 board members that were opposed to that proposal, that wanted to go back to one high school. There were 3 board members that had publicly come out and said that they supported that proposal. And there was 1 board member that had not made up her mind yet. And I'm not 100% sure who that was, so I'm going to be careful
okay.
here. You'd have to look it up in public record, but she was the last one that voted. So we rotate votes every meeting on every issue. The votes rotated around. Just so happened that she was going to be the 7th voter.
Wow.
Of us. Luckily, we didn't have a 6-member board because it would have been deadlocked, which everything would have failed.
Yeah. Who was the superintendent at that time?
The superintendent at the time was Dr. Ed Raywald.
Oh, okay.
And I did work with Bill Nigg for one day, Tom Stark, who ended up to be president of Winona State University and a vice president at Minnesota State. Red Raywald was one of the superintendents that I worked with for about 10 years. He went on to the Apple Valley Rosemont Egan School District. Then Ray Schwiniger for 2 years, and then Paul Bioffus came in, and then he moved on to Wayzata. Then Eric Bartleson from Lake Crystal came for 2 years, and then the last 12 years of my career, Dave Dakin and I shared the superintendency, probably the first co-superintendents in the state for 4 years. And then I was sole superintendent for my last 8 years. But back to the big decision. Everybody was on pins and needles, the room was full, and the board member voted to maintain the east side school district and the west side school district, which ended up to be the absolutely correct decision, because what happened shortly thereafter is we started to grow again. And by the middle of the 1990s, we were back up to 7,000 students. And then that was the second probably major facility type issue, was to remodel West High School. That building was built in approximately the 1950s. Nothing had been done. The windows were in dilapidated condition. In fact, we had not had a bond referendum for an extended period of time. And so in the early 1990s, when Paul Biofuss was here, we had our first bond referendum, and that was to substantially renovate, or completely renovate West High School, to add a middle school, a new middle school, both on the west side of town and the east side of town, and to do some remodeling and improvements at our other buildings. Unfortunately, the first time we went out for that election, it was sticker shock to our residents, and I think I would call it a resounding defeat.
Okay.
As I recollect, the vote yes was in something like 20 to 30% range, wow. And the vote no was close to 80% range. But we knew we needed to get the projects done. We came back with another scaled down version, which was once again was defeated, but it was much closer. And I can't remember how we scaled it down, but it was mostly dollars. Every time we did this, we went out and visited the citizens of our community, and then came back finally for the third time in 1991, I believe it was. And we actually added more dollars to the proposal by converting the 4-room schoolhouse at Eagle Lake to a full elementary school. Because we heard from citizens that growth was going, once again, a very wise move as you look. All of this ended up to be, as I look back on my career, and obviously there are many people that have to take credit for these things, school board members, staff, superintendents, citizens most importantly, that pulled together and made the right decisions. But they did pass that referendum. But the scaled down referendum did not include a middle school on the east side of town. And it was probably my biggest disappointment over my career, because it was the right thing to do, but the cost was just too much for our citizens, and they said we can't afford that. We really couldn't justify it because the growth on the east side of town wasn't there. And boy, as you look back on it, if we could have built it then, we would have saved a lot more than we just recently had to spend to do it. But by the same token, I'm excited about what's happened recently, and we finally have that new middle school under construction for the east side of town. So big changes then. Garfield remained a 6, Franklin a 6, but it solved our space problems at West High School. Was way overloaded with students as a 7, 12. At that same referendum, we did expand East High School with some additional classrooms. It made that situation more comfortable, but certainly not ideal, because all the basic general support spaces had to be shared. The lunchroom did, and it was a lot of long lunch hours, and so it really wasn't still best for kids. But that was an exciting time, passing that referendum and going through that. Then we hit of course, one of the most difficult personal events was the meningitis outbreak. And when I say it's personal, John Janaveris, that was a hockey player that passed away, was one of my son's best friends. Oh my! And we were neighbors, fairly close neighbors with the Janaverises. And of course, that was not only those. I was at the basketball game when the second young man, the Kratzky boy, came and sat next to his dad before the game, the varsity basketball game, and both his dad and I looked at him and we said, "What are all those blue marks on your arm?" And he ended up being the second one that came down with meningitis, and of course I think there were 7 or 8 students plus one baby and one adult that were affected by that. And of course it was a very tragic time for our whole community, and a very frightening time, probably the most frightening time when I think about my 35 years here, because we were all worried about our children and their well-being. And once again, it was very controversial, because the school officials, we had to go with what the state, and it was Mike Osterholm, I believe, was the health guru of the state at that time, and there was a lot of criticism because we kept school on. And we had probably the most contentious public meeting in the West High Auditorium at that time, when the decision was made to hold school. That auditorium was packed with people saying, "How can you do this? Meningitis can be transferred between students." And as Mike Ostrom said, it was their belief that there'd be more transfer because if students weren't in school, they'd be together unsupervised and possibly get more of it that way. So that was very controversial, but we did go through that period of time successfully and moved the district, move forward. And there's always budget problems. There's never, as I always told my golfing group, there's never enough dollars. There was operating referendums in between. Unfortunately, schools now, I think the good example is last year's probably the biggest reserve that the state of Minnesota had, and school districts got a 2% increase. We're used to between 0 and 1.
Yeah.
And obviously, inflation is usually going up higher than that, so lots of referendums were over the years, and we have just great support here. The other thing I was always so pleased with is the way the various city managers, mayors, and council people, we're an educational community. We started around 2000 of having a monthly meeting with the college presidents, including Gustavus, South Central College, Minnesota State University, Mankato, Bethany, the mayors, the city managers, and the superintendent. And out of that came a lot of collaboration. And one of the ones that I was most pleased with was the creation of the Mankato Diversity Council. The first meeting that we had, and this echoes because not to the degree what's happened in Missouri just this past week, but President Davenport was talking about the stresses at Minnesota State University with students being able to acclimate themselves into the community. Okay. There's no place for some students to get their hair done, all those sorts of things that we, as the white majority, don't think about. Right. And also at that time, Rochester was going through a very troubled time with the Somali immigrants coming into town and other immigrants, and how do we blend that in? And so we did create the task force and created the Greater Mankato Area Diversity Council. And there's once again the people that are directors that we've had, and it's carried on by Bukata Hayes, but I think it served our community well, and we've become a more welcoming community. There's always more work to do, but that was another part that I was very pleased to be in with. I've talked about a lot. Those are some of probably the highlights of my tenure. Once again, we had great school boards, great leadership. I know Jonathan Zert talks about that with our community, both in terms of city managers. One thing that I think have served us well, even though it's good to turn over, and it's one of the reasons I retired after 12 years. I think sometimes it comes a point where it's good to have new leadership, to get new ideas at the top, and I think Superintendent Allen has really come in and just done a marvelous job with our school district. But we had our city managers along. We were able to get a lot done because we knew each other, we trusted each other. The Tom Anderson field up at Kennedy was one project that I really appreciated, because Tom Anderson was our community ed director and a friend of mine for years, and died suddenly, and was a great community ed director. And the city of North Mankato brought their crew over it was a project in Mankato, but North Mankato brought their crew over and blacktopped the parking lot. And the Mankato did the grading work on the fields, and the district, of course, put the property in. And it's just one example of how we work together to share. And another thing was Lincoln Community Center, repurposing that old building into a very special place, and having early child and family education there with our alternative education program. And that program, they interacted together. And it was a place for young women that had a child, and they could put that child downstairs in our daycare, and it's just a vibrant place. And then the second floor was our adult basic education program, where we're teaching our immigrants that come in English language, and everybody interacting together. And we have been able, we're one of the few districts that still have buildings that were built in the 1920s that are serving us well. We've maintained them, and they do have a purpose. They're beautiful. They have a lot of history, and both the Lincoln and Franklin auditoriums, for instance, and they've served us well.
What was some of the process that you went through with Lincoln Community Center? Because it was lots of nostalgia associated with that building, and many people, I'm sure, didn't want it taken out of the regular schooling, but it's served, like you say, the community so well since then.
Well, it has since then, and that goes back to the mid-1980s when we closed the junior high. We were really left. Garfield we repurposed through working with the South Central College. That was their nursing program, if you remember. Franklin we repurposed by putting the sixth graders there. Then a couple of years later, we repurposed Garfield from the nursing to the sixth grade school on the west side when our enrollment started to go. But we were really sitting with Lincoln as a building that we didn't know what to do with. And it was probably the building that needed the most work. Now we knew we needed to move the alternative school out of West High School because that's where that started. And that wasn't the best place for it. And so we knew that could take up one floor, but we still had two other floors to do that. And in my job as Director of Business Affairs, then we opened it up for rentals to nonprofits. And we put quite a few nonprofits in there to make it keep going. We didn't have everything full, but we did that. And I can still remember Mr. Art Petrie calling me up and not happy with me because we were competing with him for space. But we did it anyway. And that's where, youth football, you just go through, and we had different agencies in there. And it served us well, and it's got us by to the time when early childhood and family education was a relatively new program. And it really started to grow. So we did have space, so we put that in there. And then the adult basic education program is another one who saw immense growth in the 80s, 90s as more immigrants moved to our town. So it was lucky we did hold on to those spaces because, like I mentioned before, it served us immensely.
And you talked about how they've been maintained, but a lot of that has to come from the fact that the folks in the district agreed to bond referenda to...
Well, that's the ultimate, and I've mentioned that a number of times. Our citizens, this is an education community. And they support education. They hold us accountable too, but they support quality programs, quality schools, and it's been cost effective because we do that. Because every cost comparison we looked at, because we were able to repurpose those buildings, our facility costs, all those things were lower than other similar sized communities. And the citizens have been supportive of it, and I thank you. Because you were involved with my last project.
Yeah.
And my last major project was building our first elementary school since I believe it was 1970s. I think it was Kennedy and Hoover were the ones.
Yeah.
So our enrollment was growing. In fact, I'm pleased that I was involved with all the projections for enrollment, and I thought we'd be going up to about 8,000 students, and we're getting close to that in the district. And those students at that time, when I was still there at the end of my career, were in the elementary, and we needed a new elementary, and once again the citizens came forward and supported us in building Rosa Parks Elementary, and I think that one thing I stayed out of was picking paint colors and names of schools, but the committee that picked the name of Rosa Parks, I think, sent a great message to all our citizens too, how we know, understand, and accept diversity in our community. And that building is serving us well, and we had some good leadership in that campaign.
Well, and talk a little bit about how the community that you serve has changed since the mid-70s.
Well, it's changed in a lot of ways. First of all, when I first came here, our population was, I don't know the exact statistics, but I'll go out on a limb. It was probably over 95% white population. And I'll go on another limb and say, then, well, I know this is a fact. Now we're approaching 35 to 45% students on free and reduced price lunch. We were probably about 10% at that time. So we saw ethnic diversity, economic diversity, and age diversity. our population has aged, but we continue to see that support from seniors because I think of the programs we have and the ways we're able to commute with them. So a tremendous difference. And as I still work with school districts and see that all of our school districts change, the biggest thing is economic diversity. And economic diversity is about opportunities. And there's a wide gap now between kids that go to a preschool that has educational programs components, and they come to kindergarten knowing their ABCs already, and young people that haven't had that opportunity. And that's created a large challenge for our educators working in the classrooms to handle, and they have handled it very well, but it is a big challenge. So diversity has been a big change. It's been a positive change, though.
Yeah. And for some reason, I seem to be running low on power, but I've got my voice recorder out here as well.
Well,
so.
I think we're about done anyway.
Well, one thing I wanted to talk about was if you can touch on some of the trends, the differences in educating students that have taken place.
Oh, it's a remarkable change in terms of the classroom. You know, the classroom are the same four walls and the seats are there, but how we deliver education now, how we diversify education, how we're held accountable for academic achievement now has changed immensely. And in some cases there's too much testing now and we need to back off. But that movement to hold us more accountable for each individual child rather than, the best way to say this is before, I think it was the kids are to come to school and expected to learn from the teachers. Now the kids are still come to school and expected to learn, but we as educators takes much more ownership in their success. And I think that has raised the bar immensely and help us to overcome those diverse challenges that we have seen, but we still need to do more. So how we deliver education, the course offerings have expanded immensely. What kids know today compared to when I went to high school is unbelievable.
Yeah.
And the last thing I mentioned, first comes to mind, is technology is amazing. How we've integrated technology into schools, and we still need to do more of that, because that's how kids want to learn. And offering different options. Charter schools, online learning, all those things are, because kids learn in different ways. We know that.